The massacre of Nanjing is so horrifying that it's been dubbed the forgotten Holocaust of World War II, and for good reason. In just a few weeks, over 200,000 men, women, and children were brutally exterminated by the Japanese in the most nightmarish of ways. But what makes it so horrifying isn't just how many people were killed, but how quickly the atrocities were carried out. And the most shocking thing of all, most people have never even heard about it. But this documentary deserves to be heard, and like the Holocaust, never forgotten. It all started in 1937 when Japan launched a full-scale war against China, kicking off World War II from the Asian perspective. But to understand the context of the war, we must go back to 1800s Japan, back when the last of samurai roamed the streets with their katana swords and wakizashi blades. The aging Atakabuna warships sat at bay awaiting war, and geisha flourished in ochayas with seductive elegance, performing buyo dances and chanoyu tea ceremonies. Farmers tilled the land for rice and barley, artisans crafted imadeware pottery, and merchants sold sake and ukiyo-e paintings. They all lived different lives, but they were all united by one incisive thing. Their government cut them off from the outside world, severed like an umbilical cord since birth from anyone who wasn't Japanese. Until 1853, that is, when the United States cracked them open like a walnut, plopping them out of their heavenly hall. In a nutshell, Navy officer Matthew Perry cruised into Japanese territory with state-of-the-art military steamboats unlike anything the Japanese had ever seen before, demanding they stop being such an agoraphobic, antisocial mess and do business with them like normal countries do. Shocked, intimidated, and scared, they shamefully tucked their tail between their legs, doing exactly as the Americans demanded, and they never forgave America for it. Now you might be wondering, what the heck does this have to do with the massacre in China that occurred nearly 100 years later? Everything, because Japan was hell-bent on revenge and sought vengeance not just on the Americans at Pearl Harbor, but inadvertently China by slaughtering hundreds of thousands of innocent men, women, and children that we'll get into in just a few minutes. But first, the Japanese spent decades getting as strong as possible, advancing scientifically, economically, militarily, all with one goal in mind: revenge. But in the process, they lost themselves. They developed a superiority complex, believing they were not only better than everyone else like the bullied becoming the bully, but were destined to conquer Asia like Alexander the Great. They became hypocrites, doing to Korea what America had done to them by forcing the Koreans to sign the humiliating Treaty of Kanwa of 1876. Then, they fought against China in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894, and even the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. Then came World War I, which rewarded them with an amazing economy. It was all complex and highly confusing, but the big takeaway is this: bit by bit, inch by inch, the Japanese transformed into true monsters with an inevitable massacre on the horizon. They won every single war, which boosted their superiority complex more than ever before. They went from thinking they were the greatest thing since sliced bread to thinking they were the bakery itself. But the Americans became tired of their craziness. They went from opening Japan to closing it back shut because foreign investors ghosted them from economic trade. But the pheasant was out of the bag and there was no putting it back in. Japan's economy crumbled and things became darker than ever. With mass starvation on the rise, ultranationalism filled the blocks, and envy of neighboring countries blew in the wind. To ensnare prosperity and achieve glory, lustful eyes fixated on China, a country they thought had way more than they deserved. The Japanese staged a false flag event, pretending China attacked the railway system that ran through it. This gave them the excuse they needed to get their foot in the door by taking over a place called Manchuria in 1931, but it was still too early for a full-on war. In the years leading up to the massacre, the Japanese planted the seeds for a genocide by going full-on crazy. transforming their schools into miniature military units, teachers pumping their students full of Chinese hate, and propaganda of how the Japanese were the master race, the ones destined to take over all of Asia. The teachers taught their students Bushido, or Way of the Samurai, and ruled over them with an iron fist, physically beating them down to mentally toughen them up, with those unable to take it committing suicide. And then, in July of 1937, they were ready for war. Be sure to subscribe if you like this documentary so far. The Japanese declared a full-on war with China by using the children they raised to hate their enemy. They did so after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which for the sake of brevity I won't be covering in this video. But the big takeaway is that it led into the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, kicking off World War II in Asia. The Japanese were so full of themselves that they believed they could take over all of China in just 3 easy months, but reality kicked them harder than Sanji from One Piece. When they advanced to Shanghai in August of 1937, Marines outnumbered them by 10 to 1, and much like the lessons the Americans learned when invading Vietnam, the Japanese faced the harsh realities of prolonged warfare when spring turned into summer and summer turned into winter. They eventually captured Shanghai in November, but they weren't even close to taking over the country as a whole. Disillusioned and slapped in the face harder than Chris Rock, the Japanese couldn't swallow the bitter truth that they weren't the hot shit their mothers, teachers, and mentors told them they were their entire lives. How dare the Chinese be able to hold their own against us, the superior race, the Japanese thought. So, after struggling so hard to conquer Shanghai, the Japanese brutes marched towards their next target. It was a city called Nanjing, which was then capital of China. They advanced with unmatched bitterness and resentment, hell-bent on exacting revenge in what became one of the bloodiest massacres in human history. In November 1937, the Japanese left Shanghai, moving towards Nanjing in 3 separate units. The first unit was led by General Matsui Iwane, who was a pathetically small, weak man with tuberculosis. But despite his ailments, Matsui Iwane was the head honcho, the one in charge during the Battle of Shanghai. He traveled along Lake Taihu. Next up was Lieutenant General Nakajima Kisego, a sadistic freak with a kink for burning bodies with special oils. He moved northwards of Matsui Iwane, traveling along the famous Yangtze River, which flowed through Nanjing. Lastly, Lieutenant General Yanagawa Heisuke, a short, bald guy with a love for books, moved northwest. In short, they were all to rendezvous near Nanjing. Then, they'd capture the city under General Matsui Iwane's command. But he was a sick man and fell ill before making it to Nanjing. Unfit for battle, on December 5th, Emperor Hirohito flew out his uncle, Prince Asaka Yasuhiko, to replace him in the Battle of Nanjing. But that was a huge mistake and a big problem, because Prince Asaka was a true monster and pure evil, the Joffrey Baratheon of Imperial Japan. Before the Battle of Nanjing, secret orders were sent out under his seal. It read, "Kill all captives." But don't get it mistaken, they were all monsters. Along the way to Nanjing, they razed everything in sight, annihilating villages such as the once culturally rich Suzhou city. Adorned in hoods like secret assassins, they infiltrated and decimated the city, murdering and raping the villagers. 2 shining examples of military excellence, Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, competed with each other en route to Nanjing to see who could behead 100 people first. This contest was even covered by a major Japanese newspaper titled 100-Man Killing Contest, enjoyed by their readers back home. Imagine you were a citizen of Nanjing before the war. Maybe you were a shoekeeper, a factory worker, or a teacher. Either way, you were lucky because you lived protected, encircled by a mini Great Wall of China, considered by many one of the great wonders of the world. But this benefit came at a cost so hot that you would think global warming invented a time machine, because the city was a heat chamber in the summer months, becoming known as one of the 3 furnaces of China. But you never would have guessed that in just a few days' time it'd be set ablaze, and everything you knew and loved would come crashing down in flames. But who am I kidding? Shanghai was captured just last month in November, and Japanese troops were marching straight towards where you were at. Government officials fled the first week of December, replaced by military soldiers that dug trenches and installed machine guns along the impenetrable wall that was no longer feeling so invincible. And the scariest part of it all? The Chinese military burned down everything outside of the city walls within a mile radius. They said it was to create a battle zone to stop the Japanese from using their structures, but you wondered if it was really because they were frustrated over their loss in Shanghai and wanted to leave the Japanese with as little as possible should they capture Nanjing too. But it didn't matter. War was coming, and there was nothing you could do about it. But thankfully you've got me, the arbiter of this story, and I've taken a liking to you. So be sure to hit that subscribe button as a thank you, because I've bought you a train ticket to Hangzhou during the evacuation period, where everyone who left could, leaving only the old, poor, or disabled behind. Only question is, will you take the ticket or risk it all and stay? The Japanese arrived outside of the city gates on December 9th, 1937, resisted by Chinese troops from the National Revolutionary Army. They heroically defended the city until its inevitable fall 4 short days later. Warlord Tang Shenzi was in charge of defending Nanjing, but it was all rigged from the beginning. He never stood a chance. Despite all of the preparations of his men clearing out a battlefield outside of the city gates, digging trenches and installing machine guns along the walls, the leader of the Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek, ordered for the Air Force to retreat from Nanjing, leaving the city defenseless from the skies. But not only that, many of Tang's soldiers spoke different dialects of Chinese. Just imagine how difficult it was for all of them to communicate with each other. If that wasn't bad enough, most of the men became soldiers overnight, having never fired a weapon in their life. The few soldiers that knew what they were doing were mostly from the Battle of Shanghai and not yet fully recovered. No wonder Tang tried to negotiate a truce, but China's leader Chiang Kai-shek rejected it outright, telling him he and his men had to fight to the bitter end. So, with no choice left but to fight they did. Tang's men fought fiercely, but as you guessed, it went horribly wrong, very quickly. They were bombarded by airplanes, and on the ground got trampled over like ants with artillery fire. The main city walls were just about to be breached, and the inexperienced troops couldn't do a dang thing to stop it. Tang had no choice but to retreat on the 12th of December, but like a bunch of chickens with their heads cut off, chaos erupted. Soldiers frantically shed their uniforms like snakes, stealing clothing from shops and ripping it off citizens to blend in with the common folk. Others chaotically scrambled to the Yangtze River, where boats awaited those fortunate enough to make it. But it was pandemonium, the scene not too unlike the Titanic, where there were mounds of people but not enough boats. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers fought over the vessels. Axes swung down over the hands of those clamping onto the edges, and gunshots rang out into the air, warning others to get back. And just like that, after 4 days of a ferocious battle and a frantic retreat, it was all over. The Japanese marched into the mostly defenseless city the following day, on December 13th, 1937, now about to commit one of the most unspeakable massacres in human history. But let's say you didn't board that train. Let's say you stay behind instead, in a city filled to the brim with defenseless men, women and children who were too poor to evacuate, soon to be subjected to the worst horrors imaginable. With the war lost and the soldiers marching into the city, you were terrified. But maybe you could get along with the Japanese. Heck, many of your neighbors thought so. They believed that by welcoming the Japanese, things would go in their favor. Some even convinced themselves that the Japanese would treat them better than their own government that frantically abandoned them. And it made sense, because the Japanese dropped leaflets from the skies before the war, threatening hell if you resisted, but paradise if you peacefully surrendered. And you, well, you did anything but resist. You were just a civilian after all. You watched as your neighbors hung up Japanese flags outside of their windows, and observed as they happily rushed out to greet the foreign soldiers that marched through the city gates. But let's face it, you're not naive, and you knew something bad was about to happen. Your worst fears quickly rang through as the Japanese opened fire, trampling your neighbors down like ants, murdering everyone in their wake as fleeing bodies splattered the sullen streets. They were like Shinigamis or death gods, but they were no gods of yours, and you knew it was time to get the heck out. It was time to flee. Now we reach the climax of the story, the darkest part that'll make your skin crawl. Quick note, I had to censor most of this section because YouTube said it did not fall within their guidelines. Thank you for your understanding. The massacre started on December 13th, 1937, and lasted 6 weeks, resulting in over 200,000 deaths. The Japanese begun their mopping up operations, as they called it, by murdering all of the Chinese soldiers. First, they tricked most of the remaining soldiers into surrendering peacefully in exchange for fair treatment. But to weed out any soldiers in hiding, they also searched the entire city, going door to door, rounding up every healthy young man they found as if he were a Jew in Nazi Germany, just in case he might have been a soldier. Then, they split them up into groups, brought them to remote areas, and gunned them down with machine guns, and hacked and stabbed them to death with swords and bayonets. Their bodies were dumped in massive, rectangular graves and bayoneted to ensure there were no survivors. But the massacre went on for several weeks, and things only got darker. For fun, the Japanese played games to see who could kill the fastest, similar to the 100-man killing contest. First, they lined up the prisoners in rows around the rectangular grave. A survivor who hid beneath a pile of corpses described the ordeal, unable to forget their laughs. Even more horrifying, the Japanese forced their prisoners to bury each other alive. They forced one group to dig their own grave. Most of these murders took place along the famous Yangtze River or in remote areas near Nanjing, but things weren't any better in the city itself. For even more fun, the Japanese corralled a large group of citizens into the top story of a building and set the bottom floor on fire. Then, the Japanese demolished the stairs, entrapping them inside. Remember, you can skip to the next section of this documentary, because just when you thought it couldn't get any darker, it becomes pitch black. At least 100 men had their eyes. If you were a ghost roaming these forsaken streets, you'd have seen soldiers crucified on electrical posts, some nailed to wooden boards and ran over by tape. Which leads us into the next part of this massacre. At least 20 to 80,000 women and children were raped. Streets were littered with the corpses of victims with rods, twigs, and beer bottles. Them in their own homes, but in broad daylight in the middle of the street in front of witnesses. They even plastered posters throughout the city, luring their victims to marketplaces with fake promises of allowing them to exchange bags of rice and flour for chicken and duck, only to be met by a platoon of soldiers that raped them. And it didn't matter if they were farm wives, teachers, or Buddhist nuns. No female was safe. But things get much darker as we enter hell itself. They cut open. I could go on, but I'll focus on just a few specific events. Homes. They broke into homes like the Shia family, where on December 13th, 1937, 30 Japanese soldiers killed the husband and raped him. But the horrors didn't end there, because there were more girls in the house. But the point is that atrocities like this happened all the time. Slavery. Girls were used as slaves, housed in buildings the Japanese converted into barracks for the soldiers. Many of the girls were tied naked. Incest. They forced fathers to rape their daughters, brothers their sisters, and sons their mothers. In one sickening case, Japanese soldiers intercepted a family crossing the Yangtze River. They raped the daughters in front of their parents, then demanded the father do the same. Rather than obey, the family leapt into the river and drowned. Escape. To evade, women hid in fuel stacks, inside pig pens, and beneath piles of grass, whereas others dug holes in the ground. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and many women suffered beneath piles of bodies for days on end. If caught, girls who resisted were often made examples of by gouging out. But women are anything but dumb and improvise quick-witted tactics to evade harm's way. One girl shoved her fingers down her throat and threw up all over herself, causing her captors to push her away in disgust. But this tale isn't all dark and gloom, for within the darkness a dim, wavering light shone bright enough for those fortunate enough to catch it, like a firefly gliding through solemn meadows. Whereas one girl cut her hair like Mulan, disguising herself as a boy, and another rubbed soot on her face to appear like an old lady. One girl in particular dressed up like Sophie Hatter by walking with a limp and a cane and carrying a 6-year-old child on her back. She bravely traversed the dangerous streets towards the one place she was safest at, the International Safety Zone. Your survival clearly wasn't where you were, and where you were wasn't where you needed to be. Your only chance of survival was to make it west of the city center. Therein lie the International Safety Zone, a 3-square-mile refugee camp set up by foreigners that housed over 200,000 refugees. It comprised of several abandoned buildings, including the Nanking University, the former American embassy, and various government facilities. With luck, one of those buildings would be your new home, but you'd have to navigate your way through the dangerous city to make it. And that was a life-threatening journey from which only some made it out the other end. But if you did make it, you may have been greeted by the biggest hero of the Nanjing Massacre, a foreigner named John Rabe. He ran the safety zone with the help of several other foreigners, securing food, shelter, and medical aid to hundreds of thousands of refugees, all while keeping them out of harm's way by fending off the Japanese. But here's the plot twist. He was a Nazi from Germany. But not only that, he was also the leader of the Nazi party in Nanjing. But that's precisely why he was able to do what he did without getting killed. You see, Japan and Germany were allies, so it was bad business for them to kill a Nazi. However, John Rabe was a rare breed because, according to his granddaughter, he never supported the persecution of ethnic groups, nor the extermination of the Jews. And given what he did for the women and children of Nanjing at the risk of his own life, I believe it, because he could have fled on the USS Panay gunboat, which was ironically blown up by the Japanese by mistake, but he didn't. He chose to stay behind to help the people of Nanjing. He also roamed the city in his car, preventing any atrocities he came across by yelling at and shooing away the Japanese like a pack of savage beasts. As dangerous as his antics were, he miraculously saved as many lives as the Japanese slaughtered, all under the protection of being a Nazi leader. But darkness soon swept through like forsaken winds, because the Japanese broke into the safety zone, sometimes hauling off hundreds of men and women for murder, rape, or both. Sometimes they broke in just to rape girls. He wrote letters to the Japanese embassy begging for help, but he quickly learned they had no control over what was happening. It was the military calling the shots. There was nothing he could do but save more lives, so save more lives he did. After 6 weeks, the massacre came to an end, with over 200,000 men, women, and children slaughtered, and 1/3 of the city incinerated. It was time to rebuild. In January of 1938, they installed a puppet government and forced all refugees in the international safety zone to return to their homes. They also restored essential services like electricity, running water, and mail services. And just like that, the city somewhat functioned again, as if the massacre never happened. Over the next few years, the population regrew and the cogs in the wheel kept spinning. It was like watching a clear-cut section of the Amazon forest regrow with wildlife, but the horrors beneath could never be grown over. The Japanese continued treating the population horribly. They treated Chinese workers worse than slaves, often killing them for the slightest infractions. They even drugged the population by using narcotics like opium as payment for labor and prostitution, if not their useless military currency, gunpyo. But wait, it's not over yet, so strap yourselves in like a straitjacket. The Japanese even opened a secret human experimentation facility using the people of Nanjing as guinea pigs. They called it A1644, a satellite site of Unit 731, which conducted some of the most horrifying experimentations in human history. I did a full video on Unit 731, so be sure to check it out. It wasn't until August of 1945 that everything came to an end. The Americans dropped the atomic bombs Little Boy and Fat Man on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan to surrender. They quickly fled China, withdrawing from Nanjing in the process. The people were freed, but with deep scars and open wounds that never healed. If you're wondering how the Japanese could do such horrible things, there's no easy answer. The Japanese said they murder people to prevent food shortages and stop guerrilla groups from swinging in, but in reality it had no real purpose. The massacre was a ruthless, brutal, and sadistic genocide against an ethnic group they were raised to loathe since childhood, enabled by dehumanization techniques, religious views, and groupthink. For example, their schools instilled Chinese hatred. They believed their emperor was a human god, and all other life, even their own, was fundamentally meaningless. During the war, new recruits were commonly subjected to dehumanization training, where they were compelled to murder random Chinese to toughen them up. It's no wonder then that a group like this desired revenge on the Chinese people for their fierce resistance at the Battle of Shanghai. But here's the crazy thing. There were only about 40,000 Japanese troops, but double the number of Chinese soldiers, and roughly 500,000 citizens remained in the city. Why didn't they resist the massacre? Well, the Japanese planned it all out. They tricked the Chinese soldiers into surrendering, then split them into smaller groups to divide and conquer. When the Japanese marched them out to remote areas to be executed, the Japanese lied to their prisoners, in the beginning at least. They told them they were being relocated for work. By the time the Chinese soldiers figured out what was really going on, it was too late. Not only did the Japanese tie them up, but they made a habit of starving them, making them too weak to resist even if they tried. But it's weird, isn't it? How you can witness the person ahead of you getting and do nothing about it, knowing you're next. But I guess that's just how the cherry blossoms blow. As for the citizens, well, they were mostly old men or defenseless women and children. But don't get me wrong, some resisted, very bravely so. For example, a female school teacher gunned down 5 Japanese soldiers before they shot. In another instance, 18-year-old Shuing overpowered a horny Japanese soldier, causing the pathetic wannabe to scream out for help. She furiously fought against the reinforcements, but was eventually bayoneted and bled out from the many stab wounds. But thankfully she survived, unmolested, and went on to live a long, fulfilling life. In Shuing's own words, "I had no fear in my mind. I was furious. My only thought was to fight and kill them." Finally, the question you've all been waiting for. Were the Japanese ever held accountable? 99% no, but 1% yes. You see, Japan has never accepted full responsibility for their crimes during World War II, let alone Nanjing. This is ridiculous because the massacre of Nanjing is very well documented. There's surviving Japanese military documents, field diaries from soldiers and civilians, photography and film from journalists, testimonies, confessions, trial transcripts, and even newspaper articles published in Japan during the massacre. That's not to mention the mass graves uncovered in Nanjing, and more. But former Prime Minister Tomiichi Murayama did issue a formal apology for Japan's war crimes in 1995, and other prime ministers such as Shinzo Abe expressed remorse. The current emperor of Japan, Naruhito, also expressed regret, but they were always non-specific and vague at best, and I couldn't find a single instance of any of them admitting to anything specific, least of all Nanjing. This means almost everyone involved in the Nanjing massacre got away with everything, with only their memories to haunt them, unless the ghosts of those they wronged met them at life's end. But that's just how the pokey crumbles. But this does not mean they got away with everything. Some of these evil people met justice in one of two trials: Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal. In the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal of 1946, the accused were transported back to the city to answer for their crimes. Over 1,000 victims testified, finally being able to voice their truths. Detestable vermin like Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, who played a game with each other to see who could kill 100 people first using a sword, were sentenced to death by firing squad. Hisao Tani, who orchestrated mass executions, received the same sentence. Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal covered many Japanese war crimes, but gave special attention to Nanjing. It began in 1946 and lasted 2.5 years, making it the longest war crimes trial in history. A star of the show was General Matsui Iwane. This was the guy who was going to command the Battle of Nanjing, but was replaced by Prince Asaka, whom took command of the campaign. Some historians believe Matsui Iwane was a scapegoat, which makes sense because all of the royal members were given immunity by the United States government, including Prince Asaka, so they needed someone to blame. But it doesn't matter. The tribunal found him guilty and sentenced him to death by hanging in Sugamo prison, alongside Foreign Minister Hirota Koki for knowing about the Nanjing massacre but doing nothing to stop it. If you recall, General Matsui Iwane headed one of the 3 units that marched towards Nanjing after he captured Shanghai. The sadistic brood in charge of the 2nd unit, Nakajima Kisego, participated in the massacre but never faced justice. He died after the Japanese surrendered in 1945 from kidney failure and liver disease, but rumor had it he was an alcoholic who committed suicide. The bald, short guy Yanagawa Heisuke, in charge of the 3rd unit and also a participant in the massacre, similarly never faced justice. He also died in 1945, but from a heart attack. On a side note, the wells run deep for Emperor Hirohito, who had lots of skeletons to hide, including his involvement in the Human Experimentation Lab Unit 731, and most likely the Nanjing Massacre. But that's a story for another time. But let me know if you'd like me to do a video on him, and again, be sure to check out my video on Unit 731. I'll end on this note. The massacre of Nanjing is largely unknown. I could do an entire video on why, but here's an international perspective. It was widely reported on for a time, but time goes on, and as the years went by, politics took over rationale and both the United States and surprisingly China became thirsty for Japan's friendship. China saw great business opportunities with Japan, and the United States saw a potential friend to fight against communism during the Cold War. So, instead of remembering the massacre, the world powers opted to forget it by sweeping Japan's dirty laundry under the bed and pretending everything smelled nice. And as for Japan, well, you can think of it like willful amnesia, but at least we'll never forget. To learn more, be sure to read The of Nanjing by Iris Cheng, which I relied on heavily for this video. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and let me know what historical event you'd like me to cover in the future. Thank you for joining me on yet another episode of The Untold Truths. Sincerely, David DeHaro.